Chapter 4, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. They were standing under a tree, each with an arm around each other's neck. And Alice knew which was which in a moment, because one of them had dumb written on his collar, and the other had D. I suppose they've got Tweedle around the back of the collar, she said to herself. They stood so still that she quite forgot that they were alive, and she was just looking round to see the word Tweedle was written on the back of each collar when she was startled by a voice coming from the one marked dumb. "If you think we're waxworks, you ought to pay, you know," he said. "Waxworks weren't meant to be looked at for nothing nohow." "Contrariwise," added the one marked D, "if you think we're alive, you ought to speak to us." "I'm sure I'm very sorry," was all Alice could say, for the words of the old song kept ringing through her head like the ticking of a clock, and she could hardly help from saying them out loud. Tweedledum and Tweedledee agreed to have a battle, for Tweedledum said Tweedledee had spoiled his nice new rattle. Just then flew down a monstrous crow as black as a tar barrel, which frightened both the heroes so they quite forgot their quarrel. "I know what you're thinking about," said Tweedledum, "but it isn't so, nohow." "Contrariwise," continued Tweedledee, "if it was so, it might be, and if it were so, it would be, but it isn't, it ain't, and that's logic." "I was thinking," Alice said very politely, "which is the best way out of this wood? It's getting so dark. Would you tell me, please?" But the little men only looked at each other and grinned. They looked so exactly like a couple of great schoolboys that Alice couldn't help pointing her finger at Tweedledum and saying, "First boy." "No how," Tweedledum cried out briskly and shut his mouth up again with a snap. "Next boy," said Alice, passing on to Tweedledee, though she felt quite certain he would only shout out, "Contrariwise." And so he did. "You've been wrong," cried Tweedledum. "The first thing in a visit is to say, 'How do you do?' and shake hands." And here the two brothers gave each other a hug, and then they held out two of their hands that were free to shake hands with her. Alice did not like shaking hands with either of them first, for fear of hurting the other one's feelings, so, as the best way out of the difficulty, she took hold of both of their hands at once, and the next moment they were dancing round in a ring. This seemed quite natural, she remembered afterwards, as she was not even surprised to hear music playing. It seemed to come from the tree under which they were dancing, and it was done, as well as she could make out, by the branches rubbing one across the other like fiddles and fiddlesticks. "But it certainly was funny," Alice said afterwards when she was telling her sister the history of all of this, "to find myself singing, 'Here we all go round the mulberry bush,' and I don't know when I began, but somehow I felt as if I had been singing for a very long time." The other two dancers were fat and very soon out of breath. "4 times round is enough for one dance," Tweedledum panted out, and they left off dancing as suddenly as they had begun. The music stopped at the same moment. Then they let go of Alice's hands, and they stood looking at her for a minute. There was a rather awkward pause, as Alice didn't know how to begin a conversation with people she had just been dancing with. It would never do to say, "How do you do," now, she said to herself. "We've seemed to have gotten past that somehow." "I hope you're not much tired," she said at last. "Nohow, and thank you very much for asking," said Tweedledum. "So much obliged," added Tweedledee. "You like poetry?" "Oh, yes, pretty well, some poetry," Alice said doubtfully. "Would you tell me which road leads out of the woods?" "What shall I repeat to her?" said Tweedledee, looking around at Tweedledum with great solemn eyes and not noticing Alice's question. "The Walrus and the Carpenter is the longest," Tweedledum replied, giving his brother an affectionate hug. Tweedledee began instantly. The sun was shining, but here Alice ventured to interrupt him. If it's a very long, she said as politely as she could, would you please tell me first which road? Tweedledee smiled gently, and he began again. The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all its might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright, and this was odd because it was the middle of the night. The moon was shining sulkily because she thought the sun had got no business to be here after the day was done. It's very rude of him, she said, to come and spoil the fun. The sea was wet as wet could be, the sands were dry as dry, and you could not see a cloud because no cloud was in the sky. The birds were not flying overhead, there were no birds to fly. The walrus and the carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. If this were only cleared away, they said, it would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, do you suppose, the walrus said, that they could get it clear? I doubt it, said the carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. Oh, oysters, come and walk with us, the walrus did beseech. A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk along the briny beach. We cannot do with more than 4 to give a hand to each. The eldest oyster looked at him, but never a word he said. The eldest oyster winked his eye and shook his heavy head, meaning to say he did not choose to leave the oyster bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat. And this was odd because, you know, they hadn't any feet. 4 other oysters followed them, and yet another 4, and thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more, all hopping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The walrus and the carpenter walked on a mile or so, and then they rested on a rock conveniently low, and all the little oysters stood and waited in a row. The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax and cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot and whether pigs have wings. But wait a bit, the oyster cried, before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath and all of us are fat. No hurry, said the carpenter, and they thanked him much for that. A loaf of bread, the walrus said, is what we chiefly need. Pepper and vinegar besides, all very good indeed. Now, if you're ready, oysters dear, we can begin the feed. But not on us, the oysters cried, turning a little blue. After such kindness, that would be a dismal thing to do. The night is fine, the walrus said. Do you admire the view? It was so kind of you to come, and you are so very nice. The carpenter said nothing but, cut us another slice. I wish you weren't quite so deaf. I've had to ask you twice. It seems a shame, the walrus said, to play them such a trick, after we've brought them out so far and made them trot so quick. The carpenter said nothing but, the butter's spread too thick. I weep for you, the walrus said. I deeply sympathize. With sobs and tears he snorted out those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. Oh, oysters, said the carpenter, you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again? But answer there came none, and this was scarcely odd because they'd been eaten every one. I like the walrus best, said Alice, because, you see, he was a little sorry for the poor oysters. He ate more than the carpenter, though, said Tweedledee. You see, he held his handkerchief in front of him so that the carpenter couldn't count how many he took, contrariwise. That was mean, Alice said indignantly. Then I like the carpenter best, if he didn't eat so many as the walrus. But he ate as many as he could get, said Tweedledum, and this was a puzzler. After a pause, Alice began, well, they were both very unpleasant characters. Here she checked herself in some alarm at hearing something that sounded to her like the puffing of a large steam engine in the wood near them, though she feared it was more likely to be a wild beast. Are there any lions or tigers about here? She asked timidly. It's only the Red King snoring, said Tweedledee. Come and look at him, the brothers cried, and they each took one of Alice's hands and they led her up to where the king was sleeping. Isn't he a lovely sight? Said Tweedledum. And Alice couldn't honestly say that he was. He had a tall red nightcap on with a tassel, and he was lying crumpled up into a sort of untidy heap and snoring loud, fit to snore his head off, as Tweedledum remarked. I'm afraid he'll catch cold with lying on the damp grass, said Alice, who was a very thoughtful girl. He's dreaming now, said Tweedledee. And what do you think he's dreaming of? Alice said, Nobody can guess that. Why, about you, Tweedledee exclaimed, clapping his hands triumphantly. And if he left off dreaming about you, where do you suppose you would be? Where I am now, of course, said Alice. Not you, Tweedledee retorted contemptuously. You'd be nowhere. Why, you're only a sort of thing in his dream. If that there king was to wake, added Tweedledum, you'd go out, bang, just like a candle. I shouldn't, Alice exclaimed indignantly. Besides, if I'm only a sort of thing in a dream, what are you, I should like to know? Ditto, said Tweedledum. Ditto, ditto, cried Tweedledee. He shouted this so loud that Alice couldn't help saying, Hush, you'll wake him. I'm afraid if you make so much noise. Well, it's no use talking about waking him, said Tweedledum, when you're only one of the things in his dream. You know very well that you are not real. I am real, said Alice, and began to cry. You won't make yourself a bit realer by crying, Tweedledee remarked, and there's nothing to cry about. If I wasn't real, Alice said, half laughing through her tears because it all seemed so ridiculous, I shouldn't be able to cry. I hope you don't suppose those are real tears, Tweedledum interrupted in a tone of great contempt. I know they're talking nonsense, Alice thought to herself, and it's foolish to cry about it. So she brushed away her tears, and she went on as cheerfully as she could. At any rate, I'd better be getting out of the wood, for it's really coming on very dark. Do you think it's going to rain? And Tweedledum spread a large umbrella over himself and his brother, and he looked up into it. No, I don't think so, he said. At least not under here, nohow. But it may rain outside. Well, it may, if it chooses, said Tweedledee. We've no objection, contrariwise. Selfish things, thought Alice, and she was just going to say good night and leave them, when Tweedledum sprang out from under the umbrella and seized her by the wrist. Do you see that? He said in a voice choking with passion, and his eyes grew large and yellow all in a moment, and he pointed with a trembling finger at a small white thing lying under a tree. It's only a rattle, Alice said after a careful examination of the little white thing. Not a rattlesnake, you know, she added hastily, thinking that he was frightened. Only an old rattle, quite old and broken. I knew it was, cried Tweedledum, beginning to stamp about wildly and tear his hair. It's spoilt, of course. And he looked at Tweedledee, who immediately sat down on the ground, and tried to hide himself under the umbrella. Alice laid her hand upon his arm and said in a soothing tone, You needn't be so angry about an old rattle. But it isn't old, Tweedledum cried in a greater fury than ever. It's new, I tell you. I bought it yesterday. My nice new rattle. And his voice rose to a perfect scream. All this time, Tweedledee was trying his best to fold up the umbrella with himself in it, which was an extraordinary thing to do, that it quite took Alice's attention from the angry brother. But he couldn't quite succeed, and he ended up in rolling over, bundled up in the umbrella with only his head sticking out. And there he lay, opening and shutting his mouth and large eyes, looking more like a fish than anything else. Of course, you agree to have a battle, Tweedledum said in a calmer tone. I suppose so, the other sulkily replied as he crawled out of the umbrella. Only she must help us to dress up, you know. So the two brothers went off, hand in hand, into the woods, and returned in a minute with their arms full of things, such as bolsters, blankets, hearth rugs, tablecloths, dish covers, coal scuttles. I hope you're good hand at pinning and tying things, Tweedledum remarked. Every one of these things has got to go on somehow or another. Alice said afterward she had never seen such a fuss made about anything in all of her life. The way those two bustled about, and the quantity of things they put on, and the trouble they gave her in tying strings and fastening buttons. Really, they'll be more like bundles of old clothes than anything else by the time they're ready, she said to herself, as she arranged a bolster around the neck of Tweedledee. To keep his head from being cut off, he said. You know, he added very gravely, it's one of the most serious things that can possibly happen to one in a battle, to get one's head cut off. Alice laughed aloud, but managed to turn it into a cough for fear of hurting his feelings. Do I look very pale? Said Tweedledum, coming up to have his helmet tied on. Well, he called it a helmet, though it certainly looked more like a saucepan. Well, yes, a little, Alice replied gently. I'm very brave generally, he went on in a low voice, only today I happen to have a headache. And I've got a toothache, said Tweedledee, who had overheard the remark. I'm far worse off than you. Then you'd better not fight today, said Alice, thinking it was a good opportunity to make peace. We must have a bit of a fight, but I don't care about going on for a long time, said Tweedledum. What's the time now? Tweedledum looked at his watch. 4:30. Let's fight till 6, then we'll have dinner. Very well, the other said, rather sadly. And she can watch us, only you'd better not come very close, he added. I generally hit everything I can see when I get really excited. And I hit everything within reach, cried Tweedledum, whether I can see it or not. Alice laughed. You must hit the trees pretty often, I should think. Tweedledum looked around with a satisfied smile. I don't suppose, he said, there'll be a tree left standing for ever so far round by the time we've finished. And all about that rattle, said Alice, still hoping to make them a little ashamed of themselves. I shouldn't have minded it so much, said Tweedledum, if it hadn't have been a new one. I wish the monstrous crow would come, thought Alice. There's only one sword, you know, Tweedledum said to his brother, but you can have the umbrella. It's quite sharp, only we must be quick. It's getting as dark as it can. And darker, said Tweedledee. It was getting dark so suddenly that Alice thought that there must be a thunderstorm coming on. What a thick black cloud that is, she said, and how fast it comes, and why, I do believe it's got wings. It's the crow, Tweedledum cried out in a shrill voice of alarm, and the two brothers took to their heels and were out of sight in a moment. Alice ran a little way into the wood and stopped under a large tree. It can never get at me in here, she thought. It's far too large to squeeze itself in among the trees, but I wish it wouldn't flap its wings so. It makes quite a hurricane in the wood, and here's somebody's shawl being blown away.